Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night to strange sounds coming from your living room? I'm a graphic designer living in the city center, and on that November night, an unusual sound ripped me from my sleep. Want to know what happened when I encountered unknown voices and the music of a sinister violin coming from within my apartment? Stay with me and uncover this chilling story until the end. You won't believe what happened. I'm a freelance graphic designer, living in a quirky loft in the heart of the city. My apartment is on the third floor of an inconspicuous building, its entrance camouflaged among commercial establishments and bustling bars. The unmarked door on the street leads directly to a narrow staircase, connecting only 3 units. On that November night, I was immersed in a crucial project. The hours melted away as I adjusted layouts and retouched images, lost in the digital world. It was almost midnight when I finally decided to call it a night. Exhausted, I took a quick shower and fell into bed, eager for a few hours of restorative sleep before another busy day. The silence of the early morning was occasionally broken by the distant hum of the nearby bars. After 3 years of living there, I had grown accustomed to this nightly symphony of the city. In fact, the soft, constant noise even helped me relax. Like a form of urban white noise, I closed my eyes, feeling the fatigue take over my body. My mind wandered between the last details of the project and plans for the next day. Sleep came quickly, lulled by the familiarity of the city's nighttime sounds. I don't know exactly how much time had passed when something disturbed my rest. An unusual sound penetrated my consciousness, abruptly tearing me from my sleep. I opened my eyes, suddenly alert, my heart racing as I tried to decipher what had awakened me. It was then that I realized I was about to experience one of the most terrifying horror stories. Alone at home, the digital clock beside my bed read 3:12 a.m. when my eyes snapped open. The room was immersed in darkness, but something was wrong, terribly wrong. Distinct voices echoed from the living room, penetrating the thin walls of my loft. My body froze, my mind struggling to process the situation. Slowly, I sat up in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. The voices continued, now accompanied by a chilling sound trill, dissonant notes of a violin. It was as if someone was watching a horror movie in my living room. But who and how? I thought of the 2 friends who have a key to my apartment, but quickly dismissed the idea. None of the voices resembled theirs. Besides, they always let me know before dropping by. The reality of the situation began to sink in. Strangers had invaded my space. Fear grew inside me like a cold wave. My mind raced through scenarios, each more terrifying than the last. Were they burglars? Drunk people who had wandered in by mistake? Or something worse? The scary stories of people alone at home that I had always heard seemed to come to life at that moment. Immobilized, barely daring to breathe, I remained frozen in bed. The sounds only increased my distress with each passing second. It was as if I were living through one of those true horror stories you read on the internet, but never believe could happen to you. There I was, alone, facing one of the greatest fears of any person: unknown intruders inside your home. The minutes felt like hours as I stayed motionless, waiting for the intruders to leave, but the sounds persisted, alternating between unintelligible dialogues and the eerie violin music. My body trembled, drenched in cold sweat. I knew I couldn't stay there forever, hiding like a cornered prey. With a racing heart, I made a decision. Slowly, I reached for the bedside table, where I kept a gun for protection. The cold metal of the revolver gave me a false sense of security. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. It was time to face whatever was out there. On tiptoes, I left the bedroom. The hallway was bathed in darkness, but a faint light coming from the living room cast unsettling shadows on the walls. The voices became clearer as I approached. Pressed against the wall, I crept towards the entrance of the living room, the gun tight in my trembling hands. In a swift movement, I burst into the room, ready to confront the invaders. But what I found left me dumbfounded. The room was empty and completely dark. No sign of intruders, no TV playing, nothing. The voices and music had ceased the moment I entered. Confused and even more frightened, I turned on the lights and searched every corner of the apartment. Nothing was out of place, no signs of forced entry. It was as if the sounds had been merely a product of my imagination, but I knew what I had heard. It wasn't a hallucination. I was experiencing a scary, alone-at-home encounter, worthy of the most spine-chilling true horror stories. Exhausted and bewildered, I spent the rest of the pre-dawn hours on watch, unable to fall back asleep. My mind desperately sought a logical explanation for the night's events. When the first rays of sunlight finally pierced through the windows, I decided to investigate further. I went downstairs, determined to check if there were any signs of intrusion. That's when I noticed a light on in my neighbor's film studio located on the ground floor. Intrigued, I knocked on the door. My neighbor answered, looking as tired as I felt. "Sorry to bother you so early," I began, "but something strange happened in my apartment last night." I explained the situation, watching as his expression changed from confused to horrified. "My God, I'm so sorry," he exclaimed. "I spent the whole night editing my film for the Halloween contest. I must have accidentally paired with your soundbar instead of mine. What you heard was the audio from my horror movie." The realization of what had happened hit me like a lightning bolt. All the terror, all the anxiety had been caused by a simple technological mistake. I laughed nervously, relieved and embarrassed at the same time. I returned to my apartment, reflecting on the night's events. What started as one of the most terrifying horror stories alone at home turned into an anecdote about the dangers of modern technology. I realized that often, our true scary stories have much more mundane explanations than we imagine. As I prepared to finally get some sleep, I couldn't help but smile. That night would certainly become a part of my personal collection of chilling tales, but with a very different ending than I had anticipated. It was a reminder that sometimes, the terror we feel when alone at home is just a trick of our mind, or in this case, technology. Have you ever woken up on a chilly morning thinking it would be just another normal day, only to discover a terrifying message on your window? "I'm watching you, who could have written this and why?" I was paralyzed, my heart raced, and the surrounding forest seemed full of threats. Find out with me what happened in that isolated cabin, where loneliness turned into my worst nightmare. Watch until the end if you dare. I still vividly remember that chilly spring morning when my life changed forever. It was just another ordinary day in my solitary routine, living for 6 months in an isolated cabin in the heart of New Hampshire. At 40, I sought peace and tranquility to dedicate myself to writing my first book, far from the hustle and bustle of the big city where I worked as an investigative journalist. The cabin was at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by a dense forest of pine trees. The nearest neighbors were about 400 meters away, which meant that I spent most of my time alone, immersed in the silence of nature. It was exactly what I was looking for, a refuge to concentrate and bring to life the words that had long inhabited my mind. On that morning, I woke up early as usual. The air was particularly cold, and a thin layer of frost covered the vegetation around the cabin. I prepared my breakfast while mentally planning the chapter I would write that day. The loneliness that once scared me was now my constant companion, and I felt comfortable in that isolated environment. After an hour dedicated to writing, I decided to take a break and go into town to buy groceries. I put on my heaviest coat and headed towards my truck, parked a few meters from the porch. The sound of my footsteps breaking the thin layer of ice on the ground was the only noise in that silent morning. That's when I noticed something strange, something that made my heart race and a chill run down my spine. On the rear window of my truck, covered by a thin layer of frost, there was a message written with a finger. "I'm watching you." Those 3 simple words unleashed a torrent of terrifying thoughts in my mind. Who could have written that? When? And why? At that moment, I realized that my quest for solitude had turned into one of the scariest alone-at-home experiences I could imagine. The initial shock gave way to paralyzing fear. I stood still, staring at those words written in the frost, trying to process what was happening. My mind, accustomed to creating stories, now produced terrifying scenarios. Was it some neighbor playing a prank, a lost hunter, or something more sinister? I forced myself to act. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone to call the police, but there was no signal. Of course, I thought this always happens in the scary alone-at-home stories. Except this wasn't a story. It was real. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it echoing in the quietness of the forest. I decided to go back inside the cabin, locking the door behind me. The sense of security that this place once provided had evaporated like the frost under the morning sun. Every dark corner, every shadow cast by the furniture, seemed to hide a threat. The sounds of the forest, once comforting, now sounded like sinister warnings. I spent the following hours in a state of constant alert, alternating between watching the windows and trying to rationalize the situation. Maybe it was just a cruel joke. I tried to convince myself, but an insistent voice in the back of my mind reminded me. The true scary stories I used to hear in the big city seemed to have reached me in this remote refuge. As the day progressed, my paranoia grew. Every creak of the wood, every rustle of leaves outside made me jump. I had come here seeking solitude, but now this loneliness was becoming my greatest torment. The hours dragged on and I found myself mentally replaying all the scary alone-at-home stories I had ever heard, searching for any tips, any survival strategies. Night was approaching, and with it, the fear of what could happen when darkness enveloped the cabin. As night fell, my anxiety reached unbearable levels. The darkness seemed to engulf the cabin, turning it into a prison of shadows and inexplicable sounds. Every dark corner hid potential threats, and my imagination, fueled by years of alone-at-home horror stories, worked tirelessly to fill these empty spaces with the worst possible scenarios. I decided to arm myself. I grabbed a kitchen knife and a baseball bat that I kept for emergencies. Pathetic, I thought, as if this would protect me from anything truly dangerous. But it was better than nothing. Living room window, watching the darkness outside, looking for any suspicious movement. Around midnight, I heard a noise coming from the porch. My heart almost stopped. It was the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. I gripped the bat tightly, feeling the sweat trickle down my hands. The steps stopped in front of the door. There was a pause that felt like an eternity. Then, I heard it. A knock on the door, soft, almost hesitant. I froze. My mind screamed for me to not answer, to stay quiet and wait for whoever or whatever was out there to leave. But a part of me, perhaps the part that still clung to rationality, urged me to confront my fear. With trembling steps, I approached the door. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice betraying the terror I felt. There was no response, only the silence of the forest. Gathering all the courage I had left, I opened the door abruptly, brandishing the bat, and there, illuminated by the moonlight, stood a man, not a monster, not a supernatural creature, but an ordinary middle-aged man. His eyes wide with fear, he raised his hands in a surrendering gesture, dropping something on the ground, a thermos flask. "Please, don't hurt me," he shouted, his voice trembling. "I'm just the forest ranger. I came to check if you were okay." The adrenaline still coursing through my veins, but confusion began to replace fear. I slowly lowered the bat, my mind struggling to process the situation. "Forest ranger?" I asked, suspicion evident in my voice. He nodded, still clearly scared. "Yes, I'm new in the area. I noticed your truck here a few days ago and got worried when I saw it hadn't moved. I came by earlier, but you didn't answer, so I left a message." A message, the words written in the frost. Suddenly, everything started to make sense. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning from someone trying to help. My mind, steeped in horror stories and isolation, had turned an act of kindness into an imaginary menace. I invited him in, feeling embarrassed and relieved at the same time. As he explained his work and his patrols, I realized how my imagination had run wild. The true scary stories I so feared were, in fact, creations of my own mind. As the sun rose, the forest ranger left, leaving me with a warm cup of coffee and a valuable lesson. The true horror story wasn't about a mysterious intruder or supernatural threat. It was about how isolation and fear can distort our perception of reality. On that morning, I sat down to write, but it wasn't fiction anymore. I began to recount my experience, a real-life psychological horror story. I realized that the scariest stories don't always come from outside, but from within ourselves. And as the words flowed, I felt the weight of fear lift, replaced by the understanding that sometimes the biggest monster we face is our own uncontrolled imagination. Have you ever been home alone and heard a strange knock on the door in the middle of the night? Imagine this happening while you're in a remote rural area, with no cell phone signal and the landline not working. It was just a quiet night on call, until I saw an unfamiliar, menacing face staring at me through the window. My heart froze, and in that moment, I realized I was living a true nightmare. Want to know what happened next? Hold on tight, this story will give you goosebumps. Watch until the end to find out how this terrifying night ended. It was just another ordinary night in my solitary routine. I had been working as a nurse at the local hospital for almost a decade. My home, located in a secluded rural area, had always been my refuge after long shifts caring for patients. On that particular night, I had arrived early from my shift and planned to enjoy a rare moment of tranquility. The silence that enveloped my property was comforting, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of leaves in the wind. I loved the peace I found there, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. Although loneliness weighed on me at times, I cherished my space and independence. After a relaxing bath, I put on my favorite pajamas and settled on the living room sofa with a book. Reading had always been my companion on lonely nights, and I got lost in the pages of a thriller. The clock on the wall struck just past midnight when I decided it was time to sleep. That's when I heard the first knocks on the door. My heart leaped, but I soon calmed down. It must be my boyfriend, I thought, remembering his surprise visits for midnight rendezvous. A mischievous smile formed on my lips as I made my way to the entrance. However, as I approached the door, a strange feeling washed over me. The knocks were different, more insistent and irregular. Cautiously, I peered through the small glass window next to the door. What I saw made my blood run cold. It wasn't my boyfriend, but an unfamiliar bearded face staring back at me. I recoiled from the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The reality of the situation began to sink in, and with it came a wave of sheer terror. I was alone in the house, facing one of the true scary stories I had always feared. My mind raced, searching for options. Instinctively, I reached for my cell phone, but soon remembered the damn dead zone my house was in. Frustrated, I turned to the landline phone next to the bed. My fingers trembled as I dialed, but I only met silence on the other end. The line was dead. In that moment, I felt as if I were living one of the horror stories alone at home that had always haunted me. The knocks on the door continued, now accompanied by a raspy voice. "Let me in." The tone wasn't aggressive, but the situation was terrifying. My survival instinct took over. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed the largest chef's knife I owned, and locked myself in the bathroom. There, hidden behind the shower curtain, I devised a desperate plan. If the intruder managed to get in, I would leap at him, aiming between the neck and the shoulder. It was a risky plan, but in that moment of sheer terror, it seemed like my only chance. The scary alone-at-home stories I had heard paled in comparison to what I was experiencing. The minutes dragged on as I waited, each sound amplified by fear. I heard the unknown man moving around the house, his hands sliding over the exterior siding, his fists pounding on the walls. My mind vacillated between terror and a strange satisfaction with my defense plan. Then, I had a moment of lucidity. What if there was another working phone in the house? Fear gripped every fiber of my being as I contemplated my next move. Stepping out of the bathroom meant exposing myself to danger, but staying put left me with no options. I took a deep breath, gathering all the courage I could muster. This was one of those moments of scary alone-at-home experiences that test our limits. With the knife firmly in hand, I quietly unlocked the bathroom door. Each step I took towards the living room was accompanied by the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. The intruder continued his frantic search outside, trying to force doors and windows. I could hear his frustrated attempts, which only increased my anxiety. Finally, I spotted another phone. My hands were shaking so much that I almost dropped the receiver. To my immense relief, there was a dial tone. I dialed 911 with trembling fingers, praying that the call wouldn't drop. When the operator's voice sounded on the other end, I almost cried with relief. 911, what is your emergency? The operator's calm voice starkly contrasted with the chaos of my situation. I quickly explained, my voice thick with fear. There's someone trying to break into my house. I'm alone. Please send help. The operator assured me that the police were on their way, but that it would take about 15 minutes for them to arrive. Those were the longest 15 minutes of my life, worthy of the most intense, true, scary stories. Following the operator's instructions, I went back to the bathroom, this time with the phone in hand. Every sound from outside made my body tense. The operator stayed on the line, his voice being my only anchor to sanity in that moment of terror, alone at home. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens approaching. The relief I felt was indescribable, like a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The intruder's attempts to break in abruptly ceased. Still trembling, I stepped out of the bathroom and made my way to the front door, the knife still clutched in my hand. I watched through the window as 2 police cars pulled up in front of my house, their lights flashing in the darkness. The officers quickly got out, guns drawn, and approached a staggering figure in my garden. To my surprise, it wasn't the menacing, bearded man I expected to see. Instead, I saw a disheveled young man, clearly intoxicated. Being handcuffed without resistance, he seemed confused and disoriented, mumbling incoherent words as the officers guided him to the squad car. One of the officers approached my door, asking me to come out and provide some clarification. With my legs still shaking, I stepped out and recounted my experience to the policeman. He listened attentively, his expression a mix of understanding and mild amusement. "Ma'am," he began, "it seems we had a misunderstanding here. This young man was at a party on the street over and got disoriented. He thought this was his friend's house and was trying to get back to the party." I stood there, stunned by the revelation. All that terror, all the panic I felt, had been caused by a confused, drunk young man, what I imagined to be one of the horror-scary stories. Something worthy of the creepiest midnight, alone-at-home tales. Turned out to be a mistake. As I watched him being driven away, a mix of emotions washed over me. Relief, of course, but also a tinge of embarrassment for having imagined the worst. I realized that fear had amplified every sound, every movement, turning an innocuous situation into a vivid nightmare. I thanked the officers and went back inside my house, exhausted but grateful that it had ended well. As I locked the door, I reflected on how our minds can create the most terrifying, true, scary stories from mundane situations. That night, though terrifying, served as a reminder that danger isn't always real, even when we're alone at home facing the unknown. If you enjoyed the video you just watched, you won't want to miss this next one. Click now and I'll see you there.